Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. So I'm here this week with University of Ottawa constitutional law professor Carissima Mathen, and I figured because if we are going in an election, there's going to be a bit of a post-mortem aspect to the pandemic as this. And one of the things that has been a recurring theme has been, why didn't the government use the Emergencies Act? Carissima has written a lot about this, and I figured we'd have a bit of a discussion. So uh, you wrote a chapter in a book about the early days of the pandemic in terms of the policy decisions. And you kind of made the case that there wasn't really an appropriate use of the act in there in terms of what it could have done for the government. And I figured we could kind of delve into that a little bit to start off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm really happy to be here. So I think we should understand the different ways in which we can speak about an emergency. So there is the Emergencies Act, which is federal legislation that has a whole panoply of powers and processes to deal with a variety of defined emergencies. So everything from natural disasters to invasion, right? Like they kind of go, they run the gamut, and they have different processes. So that's like a pre-existing statutory framework. There is also a special power under the Constitution, our Constitution, which gives Parliament, so that's the legislative branch, the power to enact extraordinary legislation when it perceives there to be an emergency situation. And that power is really unlimited. Like there's no real defined parameters to what Parliament could do if it apprehends an emergency, except for the fact that the legislation has to be temporary. Right. So when people talk about an emergency, what I've noticed under the COVID-19 experience is they're often referring to this pre-existing federal framework, which, because it defines the types of emergencies and then correlates the powers depending on what kind of emergency it is, that's where you get a bit of a misfit between what people were wanting the prime minister in particular to do, and what the act actually could permit him to do, versus this really quite unlimited power of Parliament to act as it sees fit in a circumstance that it considers to be an emergency.
Okay, that's interesting to break down, because one of those things that often came up were basically having the federal government extend into areas of provincial jurisdiction, and whether that was healthcare or, in certain cases, landlord and tenant legislation. And it was always kind of one of these things for me where people were saying, well, why don't they just use the Emergencies Act and make rent free for people, kind of thing. And it didn't seem to me to be the right mechanism to do that.
No, you're quite right. So the Emergencies Act, this pre-existing federal law, is more limited in what the executive branch, so the prime minister, other ministers of cabinet, can do. There has to be a parliamentary buy-in at some point. So the act itself sort of is preconditioned on the executive making decisions, and then there being a review by Parliament as well, depending on the reason for the emergency. It also requires consultation with the provinces, right? Also, so that's a process point. Yeah. Now, when you think about rent control, what's interesting is that in the mid-century, in the mid-20th century, there was a rent control system enacted as an emergency response of Parliament to the First World War, the First or Second World War. I can't remember the exact date, but and that was actually upheld at the time as, you know, a valid instance of Parliament's emergency power. But that's where Parliament makes the decision, not the executive sort of triggering as it would have to under the current Emergencies Act. And it could do that. We were in a minority parliament, so the dynamics are a bit tricky, and you absolutely will encounter provincial pushback, I think, when anytime Parliament is going to intervene in areas of provincial jurisdiction, which essentially is what the emergency power, the constitutional emergency power it is, because I would argue if it's not directly getting into an area of provincial jurisdiction, then under the federal criminal law power, which Parliament already has, it can pretty much pass criminal legislation if it to deal with a lot of emergencies. But when you have a pandemic, and the issue is healthcare and instituting public health restrictions, and you're not creating crimes, you're enacting protective schemes and supportive schemes to deal with the very specific exigencies of a pandemic. That's where you have this really tough negotiation and almost a dance between the federal and provincial orders of government.
No, for sure. And so there were two things that I also wanted to kind of touch on with the Emergencies Act is the definition of what constitutes an emergency included the fact that it needed to exceed the authority or capacity of a province. And in my reading of this, I don't think we ever crossed that threshold in what we saw in this pandemic. And I don't know if that was your reading as well, from your perspective.
Yeah, it's tricky, the extent to which that would just be a judgment call that the either the executive or maybe in the ultimate situation, Parliament would decide, and how much deference the court would grant. Because really, when you talk about a standard like that it has to be something that the province can't meet, where the rubber hits the road is if someone challenges that and says, the decision you've made actually is unlawful because it exceeds the power that you're given by this Federal Emergencies Act. And then it would be for the courts to determine that, right? Ultimately. So, there, I think there's a bit of play. And, you could argue that from week to week, there could have been some regions where it maybe was getting out of control. I mean, this is where the nature of COVID is also interesting, because if you talk about the OG version of COVID, right? It was contagious, but it wasn't Delta. Think about if in March 2020, we were dealing with Delta without vaccines. How would that play out? So, is the fact that we had thousands of people dying in long-term care homes, does that perhaps indicate that the province's capacity had been exceeded? Does that have to be a literal excess where they literally can't respond, or they are deciding not to do certain things, right? Those are all like really complicated questions that just thankfully we haven't had many situations that rise to this level of crisis. We haven't had to really parse that out. But I would say that dealing with the original version of COVID, I think you could say that the provinces in general were coping reasonably well. I mean, in hindsight, we can say they didn't make some certain decisions quickly enough, but we didn't have the whole scale catastrophe that you've seen in some other countries. That's for sure.
And when it comes to bringing in the Canadian forces, that's under existing mechanisms under public safety.
That's right, of course. But the convention, or not convention, but the practice is, the custom is, again, the federal government wants to support a province and not just parachute in the military. Right. So it's often presented as this instance of collaboration and cooperation and support, and not the federal government just bigfooting into a province. We have to sort of always remain aware of the underlying political realities of Canada as a federal state, and with a huge history of how the federal and provincial governments relate to each other.
And it's kind of that federalism aspect that was kind of the other point I wanted to touch on, was whether we think that the federal government would actually have any proper capacity to assume control over provincial healthcare systems in this case, as some people were demanding, or competency, I think is the other word, in terms of, we don't have bureaucrats at the federal level who would necessarily know what a London Drugs is in Vancouver and Edmonton in terms of distribution points or things like that.
It's a great point. And, false modesty aside, that's a point that I really made in my chapter, which is that one of the interesting byproducts of the fact that we've had this, what we call the division of powers since 1867, where, the federal order of government, creates criminal offenses and deals with immigration, and the provincial orders of government deal with healthcare and education. Part of what that does is it creates expertise and experience and capacity that you cannot just replicate in the few weeks where we were under increasing strain in March of 2020. Yeah. And one of the reasons that the federal government was able to get CERB out to millions of Canadians in a period of, I think it was 3 to 4 weeks, is you had a pre-existing federal agency, the Canada Revenue Agency, which is very used to doling out money at scale, at that kind of scale, right? And healthcare is not something that you can really control from on high and expect it to simply be delivered at the very immediate level that it needs to be delivered. And so I just think that it would have been extremely difficult for the federal government to really get in there, in the nuts and bolts of providing primary healthcare. I think that there are certain, could it have done more in terms of enabling testing, setting up testing? That's a reasonable argument. Mm-hmm. The other point that's been really sensitive is around the long-term care homes and the creation of standards and so forth. But again, to have the federal government come in and actually be responsible for regulating long-term care homes, it would be something that would require a real investment of capacity. So perhaps over time, it's something that they could do, but they wouldn't be able to do it, I don't think, at the rate and the speed you would have required.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I guess with that in mind, in terms of the division of powers, one of the things I kind of started to say as a kind of matter of course over those months was it's a division of powers and not a delegation of powers in terms that the federal government didn't delegate these powers and can take them back. They were always the province's powers ever since 1867. And that, I think, kind of helps us to conceptualize how this relationship actually works.
That's a really great point. I will probably borrow that. But you're absolutely right. There is a tendency, and perhaps particularly among the central provinces, because political power at the national level is focused in Ontario and Quebec so much of the time. There's a tendency, there can be a tendency to not recognize that the provinces are supreme in their own house, as we say in other contexts. And you are absolutely correct. The Constitution does not have the federal government or the federal order of government, because it's Parliament really, sitting somehow in a superordinate position over the provinces. The province's jurisdiction in certain areas is exclusive and complete. And, we have certain doctrines that arise in the areas of conflict. As I say, you can have a temporary assertion of those powers under the emergency power, which again is very extraordinary. But otherwise, the Parliament and the federal order of government, they can't invade the provincial jurisdiction, because that's not how our country works. That's not how our Constitution works. And yes, it can absolutely lead to inconsistency in sort of decisions. We're seeing that today with certain provinces going in a very different direction, declaring that we are now in the endemic phase of COVID-19. Other provinces are clearly not. And that is an issue, and it can be a problem, but it's not something that's amenable to just, waving a wand and making it go away. That is the system we have. And all of the relevant actors need to be on board before you can either change that in a permanent way, which I would argue is not feasible, or change it in terms of allowing the federal government to, in a certain way, assume more responsibility. They would need cooperation to do that.
Yeah, for sure. And like, just in terms of if they had asserted some authority, would the provinces actually enforce it? Was kind of one of the things I always thought as well. Sure, the federal government can come down and invoke powers to do these public health measures, but they don't exactly have a wide federal force by which to enforce it either. So it would definitely need buy-in from the provinces on that level alone.
That's right. I mean, the federal government, there is, of course, a federally mandated law enforcement agency, but it doesn't operate in all the provinces. And this is an interesting thing about the way our system works and the way our constitution works is, while, as I just said, the federal order of government, creates crimes. They enact the criminal code. The criminal law is actually enforced and administered by provincial actors, crown attorneys operating at the provincial level, municipal police forces, who I would say arguably have more contact with the majority of people in Canada than any other law enforcement branch, and so forth, and provincially appointed judges in many cases. So there's already a great deal of, and in that case, you could see it as a bit of a delegation just because of the way the Constitution works, but there's already a great deal of practical power and control that is exercised by the provinces when you're talking about something like enforcing a lockdown within a community, as opposed to enforcing the national borders and keeping people out. That's absolutely within the federal purview. But a lot of, even if you get away from healthcare, a lot of the other really important decisions and controls, they require direct interaction with people. And that's generally not what the federal government does outside of very limited contexts.
Right. Okay. I think we all learned a lot today, and it helps to make things clearer because we are going to get some postmortem stuff happening through when this election does happen. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this, and let's do this again soon.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
All right.
Dave.
Thanks. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.